Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very inspiring show coming right up. Our special guest today is Dr. Samuel-Harrington, and he's here to talk to us about his new book, At Peace, Choosing a Good Death After a Long Life. Dr. Harrington is a graduate of Harvard College and the University of Wisconsin Medical School. Professionally, he concentrated his practice at Sibley Memorial Hospital, also serving on the board of nonprofit hospice in Washington, D.C. James Fallows of The Atlantic called At Peace deeply humane. He argues the case for taking a clear-eyed yet compassionate view towards the end of life. So let's welcome to the show Dr. Harrington.
Well, thank you, Marianne. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Well, I am so glad that we're spending this time to talk, especially about such an important topic. I don't think really anyone's talking about this.
Well, there have been a flurry of books recently about it, or in the last few years, I think, but they don't really get down to what I would describe as the hard decisions. They talk around the subject and tell people to have conversations about end-of-life issues, but they don't really address the hard decisions. And I'm hoping that by telling the story of my parents' decline, largely focused on my father's decline and death, and by weaving that in with stories from my medical career, I just spur some interest in making the hard decisions, or looking at them. People have to make their own decisions, of course, but looking at some of the choices.
And moving forward with that, well, you bring a very unique perspective to the discussion, especially with your background and, being so heavily involved, of course, in healthcare for individuals. And so I think talking about, how to choose, a good death, and that's your subtitle, after a long life, it's so important. Well, why don't we start? I know you touched on this a little bit, but what was the absolute, the main inspiration behind developing this book?
Well, the inspiration grew over the entirety of my career. 2 or 3 things happened during the 35 years of my training and clinical career. First, and most importantly, medicine changed from a healing art into a giant commercial enterprise, which in and of itself is a different discussion. But because it's such a commercial enterprise, it's very difficult to stop the momentum of treatment sometimes. Mm-hmm. And it is not geared to treat elderly patients who are approaching the end of life based on a chronic illness. The second thing that happened was I witnessed my parents age and dwindle. And the third thing that happened was I matured from a young physician focused on technological skills. I was a subspecialist in gastroenterology, focused on doing colonoscopies and treating bile duct obstructions. When I matured into a physician who felt that comfort, compassionate care at the end of life was more important than technical skills when dealing with elderly patients at the end of life. And so put those two together, all those issues together, and I decided that I had something to say, and I had particularly focused on elderly people who shouldn't be subjected to technological treatments when they're not going to make an important difference in both their longevity and their quality of life. Because I think we have to keep all those things in mind.
I think it's important to keep all those in mind. A lot of times, family members probably get too, and I've seen this in my own family, maybe too involved in let's do everything to keep the person alive when, a treatment isn't going to make any difference in their care going forward.
I think that's the case, and there are. Everybody should choose their own level of treatment, and if people want extensive technological treatment, that should be considered, with the caveat that doctors are not required to supply futile treatment or to do everything that a family might want for their loved one. But I think it's more important to recognize that every survey of elderly patients shows that the majority of people, elderly people, would prefer to die at home and as quietly as possible, and hence the title "At Peace," choosing a good death after a long life. But to effect that decision to go home, it requires that people make that choice, and that's really what the book aims at.
Mm-hmm. Well, and just to clarify as well, and your book actually clarifies this, that this is not a death with dignity or assisted suicide, what we're talking about.
Absolutely not. I address physician-assisted suicide in the book, which is now known as medical aid in dying, but the fact is that it's not available to the majority of Americans, and it is unlikely that every state will pass laws in that regard within our lifetimes. So I think that people have to look at all the other aspects of end-of-life decisions. So I take the position, an intellectual one, that patient autonomy sort of rules the day. If patients want, within the legal limits of medical treatment, patients make the choices. And if one lives in a state where medical aid in a dying is available, then they should be able to proceed with learning about that, trying to understand it, and making a decision on their own. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than most people think, and most physicians are somewhat ambivalent about it. I myself can argue it both ways, and yet if my father had that available, and he did not, but if my father had medical aid in dying available, and if he had exercised that option, meaning if while he was mentally competent he self-administered a lethal dose of medication, I would have felt cheated out of some good quality time with him, because that meant he might have been mentally ready to die, but he wasn't quite physically where I was most comfortable with the process. But again, I would have respected patient autonomy.
Well, and it's so different for everybody, because I'm sure with every patient you see, everyone has a different situation. There's different illnesses and things going on. So there's no like cookie cutter approach that would apply to a mass amount of people. And that's why I felt like your book was so, it's just very informative, because it approaches it in a way, it's like, these are some things to consider, and really gives an in-depth look at some options.
You're right. There is no cookie cutter approach. There's no age at which decisions should be made. But there are general considerations that have to take place, and I try and outline them. It's hard to speak in generalities when every case is dealt with in specifics. But let me reemphasize that there's no specific age at which people should start making these decisions. There's no specific age at which people are too old to consider aggressive treatment. But there's a confluence of circumstances when people should take special consideration. So let me just address what I mean by that confluence of circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
If if people are advancing in age, so they're over the age of 65, they're advancing to 75, they're advancing to 85. At the same time, they have a chronic illness such as heart failure or cancer or dementia. As those diseases progress and as their ability to care for themselves declines, those three lines, progressive disease, advancing age, and declining ability to care for oneself, known as performance status, at some point they intersect. And at that point, patients or their families should take old age as a generality for that condition into their decision-making. They should take old age and put it in the equation they use to decide about the risk-benefit of treatments, or aggressive treatment, I say.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, I know in your book you also talk about, this all makes perfect sense, about how 70 is the new 50, and since survival rates have increased, it just means that there's a lot more for us to consider with health care and just care.
Correct. 70 is the new 50, but 86 is only the new 85, is kind of shorthand way for interpreting survival curves. And if we look at survival curves from 100 years ago, people were dying of tuberculosis at age 50 and other acute diseases. But we can now treat so many acute diseases that more people live later and develop chronic diseases. But if you focus on survival curves, or the aspect of the survival curve that deals with 85 and 86-year-olds, unlike 50 becoming 70, 85 becomes 86. There's very little shift on actual survival curves in that age range. There's an old medical aphorism that patients, or it's the responsibility of the physician to help patients die young as late in life as possible, which means, or the interpretation is, we all want to live very long, vigorous lives, and we want to be vigorous right up to the point we die. We don't want to dwindle, and we don't want to have a chronic illness. But the facts are that we do dwindle, and if we're lucky enough to live into old age, we will have chronic illnesses and problems to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really interesting. This could be it's like the most perfect time to have this discussion, especially I think the last time I saw there was 10,000 baby boomers turning the age of 65 a day now, and that's a huge group of people who are now getting into a different age bracket. That there are some things that overall that we should all be considering.
You're correct. When people look at the title of my book, they might think that it's aimed only at the greatest generation, who are the last of the greatest generation, are dying at a rapid clip currently in their late 80s and early to mid 90s. But the baby boomer generation, the leading edge of the baby boomers, are about 72 to 73 at this point, and I am a baby boomer, are sort of redefining medical care in terms of a large bulge, of a demographic bulge. And at the same time, the baby boomer trailing edge, those who are around about 55 at this point, are also making decisions for their own parents, if they're lucky enough to have parents alive. So baby boomers are really going to influence this whole process, largely because of the numbers, but also because we grew up thinking that medical progress was going to advance and sort of never slow down. And it continues to advance, but medical progress is reaching limits, and baby boomers have to recognize that there isn't a miracle cure for every illness around the corner, despite what we see on television and in television advertising.
Mm-hmm. And I know in your book you talk about how healthcare is failing the elderly. Why is that?
Well, healthcare, the American health system is wonderful in many respects, and it's really very good at dealing with acute illness, but it really is not good at coordinating care for chronic illness, and most elderly patients have one form of a chronic illness or another. In fact, as the Center for Disease Control maintains statistical records about every decade of life, it lumps people over the age of 65 with people over the age of 105 and describes or ascribes 90% of deaths to 6 chronic illnesses in that 65 to 105 age group. Those illnesses being congestive heart failure, cancer, chronic lung disease, stroke, diabetes, and dementia. And I've lost my train of thought there.
That's okay. The producer will get that.
These chronic illnesses really have to be dealt with. Oh, yes, and the American healthcare system doesn't have cures for these chronic illnesses, and it's difficult. It's harder to make money dealing with chronic illnesses than it is dealing with curing acute problems. Mm-hmm. I want to encourage people to think of doctors when we're doing the right thing. We approach disease like generals on a war footing. We want to engage the disease and the enemy with overwhelming force, and that is completely appropriate when we are dealing with acute illnesses that can be cured, and that's one of the strengths of the American healthcare system. But dying of old age or dying with old age is a special circumstance, and dying with old age is not a disease that can be cured or a battle that can be won. So some form of moderation is appropriate, and that's where I try and counsel people to rethink accepting aggressive care for every condition.
I think that's so important. I've had friends and family members who have had different illnesses or things come up, and one person I'm thinking of in particular where there's nothing that could have happened that would have made her better, but it definitely she was just looking for a pain-free end of her life, and that's kind of where that ended up going. But it took a while to get to that place because everyone's so used to kind of getting up in arms and let's see what we can do to cure this. But when you're 87, there's the age factor is something to consider.
Exactly, and although there is a slight movement among active clinical physicians to take age into the consideration, or to take frailty, which is another way of describing weak elderly people, into account, we don't do it enough, and it is not the first thing that physicians do. The first thing that physicians do is try to analyze and then treat aggressively, and it's easier to move forward. There's a momentum to treat in American medicine. It's easier to move forward. It's more acceptable to do something than to actually pause and reflect and try and slow down the type of treatment that people use. the default position in American medicine is to treat, and it's almost un-American to say, no, thank you. I simply want to go home and pass away quietly.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times people don't realize that they also have options. We've always got great doctors that we work with, but at the end of the day, it's your life. So you have to sit and consider how you want to approach this.
And the way to slow things down is to have these conversations in advance, because in the absence of conversations where a family member and a patient can challenge a doctor's recommendation to move forward with aggressive treatment, without those conversations, aggressive treatment is the fallback position. Let me sort of refer to the crux of my father's situation, which is where we had this kind of conversation. At the age of 88, my father, who appeared to be in good health, was advised that an aortic aneurysm in his abdomen was growing, and if it ruptured, he would die. It was reaching a critical stage where he had to choose some form of treatment. And he saw 3 surgeons at the suggestion of his internist, and every surgeon said, you need to have a major operation to repair this, meaning that's what they did. Now, as a physician myself, I thought, you're 88, Dad. This is a major operation. If there's a complication, it will risk your independent lifestyle, and it will certainly require significant convalescence. But there is an alternative, which is like a cardiac catheterization in the abdomen, which puts in strengthening stents, and it's done as an outpatient, and it makes good sense to me to sort of try this temporary approach. But my father was quite ambivalent about treating his aneurysm at all, and he furrowed his brow and looked across the table and raised his finger and said, why would I want to treat something that is going to carry me away the way that I want to go? And I was a little bit taken aback, but that was his vision. His vision was to die quickly and to die without prolonged dependence, and sort of like Woody Allen saying, I'm not afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens. My father was saying, I want this to be quick, and I don't want to prolong things. Well, my point is that vision informed me and my sisters of how he wanted us to address these questions. Now, as I note in the book, he did, in fact, choose the temporary procedure that I outlined, largely because we prevailed on him to eliminate this risk, because he had great-grandchildren being born, and we wanted, perhaps selfishly, for him to meet them. And he did survive 5 more years after his repair. 3 of those years were very good years. He was robust and vigorous, and 2 of those years were not. He did decline. He did suffer dependence that he'd hoped on others, that he had hoped to avoid. But for us, it was a good decision. And then later on, when he was weak, about 4 years after the initial repair, he was advised that the aneurysm was enlarging again, and he would have to have that procedure repeated. And at that point, he got on the phone with all his physicians, said, thank you very much for your care to date, and he canceled all his appointments. And that is how he recreated his vision for us, and we responded supportively.
Well, and it's, a lot of times it can be really difficult being in the hospital, and so I can understand canceling appointments and not doing that, especially, when you're looking at that transition line, that's going to happen at some point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. He had this vision. He had some knowledge of his disease. He'd actually witnessed one of his legal clients pass away from an aneurysm decades before. And he was willing to accept the trade-off. And I try and emphasize that a vision, in my father's case, it was sort of naive and required a random event, a semi-random event, the rupture, that is. But he had a vision, he had some knowledge, and he was willing to accept the inevitable. And with that, you can make a plan, and you can at least make decisions that lead toward a quieter death and lead away from a medicalized death.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I think like a lot of people look to have a peaceful death when that time comes, as opposed to one that's that they feel like it's a fight.
Right. There's another sort of quotation, a Groucho Marx quotation, that he plans to live forever or die trying. And that's a great idea, and we all want to live vigorously, but live forever or die trying is a recipe for ending up in the intensive care unit, and that is a recipe for a bad death, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to kind of piggyback on this, I mean, when we talk about, as we get towards the end of our life, some people end up in hospice care, and you have a huge chapter on hospice itself that really explains a lot of just the benefits and just information in regards to kind of what to expect.
Well, hospice is, once a person has made the decision to pass away at home and to seek the most gentle possible passage, hospice care is the foundation on which that's going to take place. And the trick is to know when to get into hospice care and how to think about hospice care. So let me just say that hospice care itself is a philosophy of treating patients palliatively in the most comfortable available surroundings and focusing exclusively on comfort and quality of life and ignoring diagnoses and ignoring any attempts to cure a disease. Now, many people think that's kind of giving up, but that's not giving up. It's really taking control of the things that a patient can still control, the decisions about that they make at the end of life, rather than leaving those decisions to doctors and nurses and technicians in a hospital system. So I think of hospice care as an alternative to the test and treat standard of care that we apply when we're aggressively treating patients. And it's an alternative system that supplies sort of a concierge 24/7 call systems so they're available to answer questions at any time. Hospice professionals are forward-thinking. They supply equipment and medications in advance of the common problems that affect patients at the end of their life. And by doing that, they stand between emergency room trips that could otherwise spin out of control when a problem develops. That is to say, when a problem develops, you don't have to rush to the emergency room to get the pain medication or the seizure medication or the oxygen, because you have those things at home. and can use them in consultation with the nurse's guidance and the nurse's analysis. One of the biggest misconceptions about hospice is that it's reserved for the last few days of life. And I've had many patients over the years say to me, I'm thinking about hospice care, Dr. Harrington, but I know I'm not sick enough for it. Well, the fact is that the best time to get into hospice is when you recognize that you will ultimately need it, and not wait until you're so sick. It's better to get in while you're well and not well, but while you can still be comfortable, and take advantage of the time with the hospice philosophy to meet with your family, create a good environment, and get over some of the side effects of the aggressive care that you had been trying to that point. It's really quite common for people to go into hospice and feel better because they've actually stopped the treatments that were making them sick.
Mm-hmm. I've known people who have been on hospice, for some time, and then they eventually go off hospice because they're doing so much better.
That's exactly right. And then they can still receive palliative care. It's just under a different sort of a regulatory approach. But then if as their disease progresses, they can re-enter hospice. Or it's quite possible that even though in principle patients are supposed to go into hospice when they are certified as having less than 6 months to live, I put patients into hospice when they might have had a year to live, and I was quite happy to re-up them, re-enroll them when they passed the 6-month mark. And that's quite acceptable for an individual physician to do. If that were the standard policy of a large hospice as an institution, they would be inviting scrutiny by the federal regulatory agency. But that's not. I think the goal is to be in hospice as long as possible, and most hospice professionals feel that being in hospice for 3 months sort of optimizes one's medical, emotional, and spiritual benefits. And that's really the whole point. But if you wait till the last few days or weeks, it still is better than dying in an intensive care unit, but you haven't really had the full benefit of what hospice has to offer.
Well, and it's such a great resource for people who are looking to make that transition peacefully. And I love the chapter in your book that really talks about it, and I learned quite a few things as well. And, even though I've kind of gone through this with a few people, so it was enlightening to just have that information and go, gosh, okay, these are some of the things that hospice can do that I wasn't, maybe fully aware of.
Well, thank you. One of the things that I mention in the book is that hospice hospice is transportable. My mother was diagnosed with lung cancer in January of 2009, I believe, and she wanted to live long enough to attend her granddaughter's wedding, and that was about 5 months away. So she chose a little bit of chemotherapy to kind of slow the lung cancer, and then we enrolled her in hospice with the understanding that she would be able to travel to Washington, D.C., where the wedding was going to take place from her home in Milwaukee. And we would have hospice contacts in Washington to call if problems came up. And obviously they couldn't solve every problem, but if she had a minor accident or a minor shortness of breath, the hospice would have brought some equipment to the hospital and would have been soothing and comforting and would have prevented an emergency room trip that would have really been disruptive to the schedule of the wedding, etc. So that kind of transportability is something that people rarely think of, but I was really comforted by that, knowing that my mother had some degree of protection while she was traveling. And my father's story in hospice is a different one. He didn't travel, but I think the lesson he taught me was that you have to shop around to look for hospices. When we went to the first hospice recommended by one of our nurse managers, they rejected him. They said he was too healthy to be admitted. He was still going out to the occasional show, maybe once a month or once every 2 months. He wasn't completely housebound. He didn't really have a diagnosis that they could certify would carry on and cause him to pass away in 6 months. So we tried another hospice, and they had a totally different perspective, and they said, listen, getting out of the house once a month is a quality of life issue. We support that, and we want him to be, and we're willing to enroll him. So, in fact, he lived 7 months from the time of his enrollment, and my mother lived 9 months from the time of her enrollment. So they both kind of broke the bank in that regard, but it was quite worth it from my point of view, because, again, I feel that they are protected from aggressive care, and that's what that was my goal.
Yeah. And, and obviously to respect their wishes, as things have gone on. Now, and you talk about this in your book about, having that hard conversation about end-of-life wishes. When should we, when's the right time to have that discussion?
There's no good answer to that, and there's no easy answer. I really struggled during writing the book trying to come up with some kind of philosophical argument that would convince people, oh, yep, it's time to have the conversation. And all I came up with was that it's more important to blunder ahead, because the alternative to not having the conversation is to be struggling with more medical care than an elderly patient would usually want. Mm-hmm. So, but to try and address the question more directly, I think that every time a medical issue comes up, it is in the interest of the family members of an elderly patient to discuss the ramifications of that medical issue. So that it could be, in the case of my father, we would discuss it when one of his friends or neighbors was hospitalized for one illness or another. We took the opportunity when he fell in his apartment, and we decided that it was time for him to get a call button, a first alert type call button. That was an opportunity to talk, to start the conversation, to review where we were going. Every time a medical issue came up for him in terms of a torn hamstring or a bruised hip, it was an opportunity to talk about things. So you really have to seek out these opportunities. You have to look at every healthcare issue and say, kind of screw up your courage. And if the patient doesn't want to carry on and talk about things, then you have to revisit the issue. But because it's end of life is a moving target, and the conditions change from month to month, people might change their minds about one treatment or another. They might want some treatment at one point and not want it later, or vice versa. We have to respect that, but we also have to keep the conversation front and center so that we know what their wishes are and we emphasize that we will be supportive.
Yeah. It's such a difficult thing, especially if someone doesn't want to have a talk about the end of life. You know, I know somebody that's like the last discussion that they want to have. You know,
right.
Unfortunately, it's like, you know, there's so much stuff that you have to do to prepare for that. You know, like, you know, medical power of attorney and different things. You just want to, there's some things that you have to, like, get squared away.
Correct. And nobody does want to have that discussion. And and even as somebody who's trying to frame themselves up as an expert on it, as I am, I don't want to have that discussion. But it's absolutely mandatory because the alternative is so much worse. To end up being treated with more than you want is much worse than trying to blunder ahead and move the discussion. And you raise a good point that there are other ways to get at this. There are, when you're dealing with a legal issue, when you're changing your will, when you're talking to your lawyer about one thing, it's worth trying to revisit this issue and review your living will too. Although I try and make the point that the written advance directives are very important to have, but the verbal advance directives are equally, if not more important, because those are for most of us, medical decisions are made in real time based on verbal conversations, reinforced perhaps by the written word of a written advance directive. But most things take place in real time based on the verbal conversation. Yeah. One of the things I'd like to touch on, if I can, is what is a good death, since it's part of my subtitle, and it's very hard for people to agree on what is a good death in terms of a global vision, but where it's been studied, and it has been studied well, there are attributes of a good death that have been quite well determined, and I believe that the best studies show that the 5 most important attributes of a good death are control, comfort, closure, affirmation, and trust. And control means the patient is making their own decisions to the degree that they can. Comfort, of course, is the absence of pain. Closure is the opportunity to reconcile with family members and friends. Affirmation is for the patient's values to be appreciated. And trust is the environment that they surround themselves with in terms of trusting their caretakers, trusting their surroundings, ideally at home or in a hospital. I mean, a hospice, standalone hospice, or a hospice bed in a nursing home. And if we were to look at the reverse of those attributes of a good death, control would be helpless. The lack of control would be helplessness. The reverse of comfort would be pain. The reverse of closure would be frustration, isolation, and the reverse of affirmation would be denial. And I think those attributes basically describe what it's like to die in an intensive care unit, and that is what I think people should try to avoid.
Yeah. Yeah, because, I mean, both that and when we look at intensive care units and nursing homes, it's a big thing is people are kind of isolated.
Yes. I think isolation is a problem at the end of life, and feeling comfortable and surrounded with trust is a great benefit.
Yeah, I like I'm so glad that you explained what a good death is, because a lot of times, people are like, well, what could that mean? And those points that you bring up are so important, especially coming from the perspective of a doctor, because you work with people, you say day in and day out, what's some of the number one things that are really troubling them?
Yeah, and everybody has a slightly different perspective on that. So my father's idea of a good death, to die from a ruptured aortic aneurysm, wouldn't appeal to most people, but for him, it was the speed and the ability to avoid a prolonged death that appealed to him. Others want something else. But in his case, he imagined that if his aneurysm ruptured, he would be in control of the circumstance, not of the disease, no, but he would take control of the circumstance by declining emergency surgery and accepting large doses of pain medicine to deal with that disease until it carried him away. And so control was the most important thing to him, and speed or quickness of the process.
Yeah. For everyone, it's so different, and that's why your book is such a great resource. I mean, I've got my little tags all over your book.
Oh, well, thank you. I have had some nice feedback from people who said it's helped them with their already, based on the galleys, and I know it's very presumptuous, perhaps even arrogant, for me to suggest how people look at end of life, but I don't feel I'm doing that. I feel that by telling the stories, I let people draw their own conclusions and see that there are other options to choose from. And the whole point is to help people make their own decisions, not to choose a specific decision.
Yeah, I really felt that, and it's a discussion that needs to be had. So I'm so glad that you wrote your book At Peace and that you're sharing this with everybody. It's such it's a book I'm going to hold on to, without a doubt, and I would highly suggest people pick up their own copy of At Peace, and you can not only read it, but give it to people that you love. Dr. Harrington, where can people connect with you and be part of your community?
Well, I have a website, samharrington.com, and on that website I have all the avenues available to communicate with me, including my cell phone number, my home number, my email address, and I would very much appreciate hearing from people who have questions and on these issues. I am not, however, very advanced in terms of social media, so I think probably the best thing to do is to email me after looking at the website and seeing what they think. And
also, of course, reading the book At Peace, because it's got so much information, such a great resource. Dr. Harrington, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Well, Marianne, I appreciate it very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Harrington. It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you and to talk about this much-needed topic at peace. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.